Thank you. Everyone can hear me well? Yes? Okay, good evening, everyone. I think it's a fair assumption on my part if I say that this image on my first slide is a familiar sight for most of the people in this audience, if not everyone in this audience. When you walk into your local supermarkets, this is something that you see. Food that is fresh, in abundance, a wide variety, fresh, lots of flavor, and perfect looking. However, our food didn't always look like this. Most of our major crops have been domesticated from wild plant species in a process that has been repeated over and over again to finally get the food that we're so familiar with. In fact, most members of our modern society probably would not recognize the very unpromising looking wild species that gave rise to our very remarkably productive crops of today. And so I would like to start with a little mini quiz for all of you to see if what I just said is really true. So I hope you can see it on the screen closest to you. What you see on this picture is a part of a wild plant species. It's obviously not the whole plant. And I would like to hear from you which modern day crop you think this was the origin of. Maize, corn, very good. So you are an exceptional audience, clearly. This is what maize looks like today and what we are all used to. So what I show over here is a maize ear, as it's called, or a maize cob. And when you peel away the outer layers, you see row after row of corn kernels, which all of you know are nicely edible. It's fleshy, it's juicy, and it's quite far removed from the image that you see, which actually shows what wild maize, which is known as teosinte, actually delivers in terms of the same counterpart. You see that it has one row of these corn kernels. Believe me, they're not edible, and each of them is encased in a very thick, hard covering, which would make it very hard to access or even eat. Another example, and I think this will also be easy for all of you. Banana. Okay, there were less hands going up, so maybe this one was tougher. I thought this would be easier. This is wild banana, and this is what our modern day banana looks like. Looks extremely good looking, very nice and yellow mostly. The flesh is sweet and easy to eat. There's hardly any traces of seeds, unlike the wild banana, which you see the flesh is often quite raw and not nice to eat, but also seeds really dominate the fruit. So over the course of breeding and domestication, traits like this have been selected for, and these traits really relate to increasing the abundance of the food, so the parts of the plant that we actually harvest, but also all kinds of other traits such as flavor, color, aroma, and also, as you see in the case of the tomato in the picture on the slide, size. So basically what you see is a wild tomato, and right next to it, a current day modern tomato. And also another trait that was selected for is the ease of harvesting. So as you can see, I cannot really point with my pointer, but at the top you see rice, and there the loss of seed shattering, which would result in the grain just being lost, was a major trait that was selected for during rice domestication. So a major point in the history of modern agriculture coincided with the end of the Second World War, when there was a baby boom, and a lot of countries were switching from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. And there were a lot of investments in health and also agricultural productivity. And around this time, a highlight of this period was what is known as the Green Revolution. And this is basically the development of high-yielding, disease-resistant varieties of maize, wheat, and corn. And these varieties, the development of these varieties, was spearheaded by an American breeder known as Norman Borlaug. And he won a Nobel Prize for his efforts. And the incredible thing about these varieties was that their adoption in a lot of countries in Asia and South America resulted in incredible yield increases, as you can see in this graph. And what was so remarkable about this was that it allowed these countries to go from being importers of food to actually producing so much that they started exporting food. And for this reason, the grain revolution was really a breakthrough and really a big achievement of the 20th century, because it addressed the problem of food security and really helped millions of farmers rise out of poverty. However, the super crops of Borlaug, even though they transformed modern agriculture, they also promoted a form of intensive agriculture which had its downsides. So basically, the Green Revolution and the varieties of the Green Revolution yielded a lot, but only if there was a lot of input of fertilizers and pesticides, which of course caused pollution of the soil and freshwater, groundwater. But also these crops required a lot of input of fresh water, which is a scarce resource, and this placed even more pressure on this very precious commodity. Also, as you all probably know, a large area or large areas of land were cleared in order to make way for this large-scale, intensive monoculture, which led to massive deforestation, but also the loss of genetic diversity. So, agriculture actually is a big contributor to greenhouse gases and has resulted or added to the speed of global warming. But paradoxically, agriculture is also one of the biggest victims of global warming. And this is because all these erratic weather events that Tessa also mentioned in her introduction, like floods, droughts, heat waves, these have a major negative impact on crops and crop production. As you can see in this graph here, it's a bit outdated, but believe me, these trends have only become worse. What it shows is the economic losses due to various different weather events, and this is calculated in US dollars, so on the y-axis it's in billions of dollars. It's calculated based on insurance payouts to farmers. But the point I'm trying to make is these losses are quite significant. Bad news is this trend is predicted to continue. So what you see on this slide right now is a map of the world which shows parts of the world which are going to become hotter in shades of red, yellow, and pink, and parts of the world that are going to become wetter. And this is based on 11 different climate models, and the strength of the color indicates the strength of the prediction. But the one thing that I want you to take away from this slide is that basically almost all the major food-producing regions of the world are affected. So we find ourselves at a point where we need even more productive crops because human population is only going up and up. But at the same time, we have the backdrop of climate change. So we basically want crops that do everything. So you can see whatever I've written on this slide, but with minimal input. And so for this reason, this has been called the greatest challenge of the century. So how do we actually address this challenge? Rising up to this challenge will require a concerted effort from various sections of our society. It will require not just scientists, but also policymakers, governments, private and public stakeholders, the public as well, in order to mediate what we call a second green revolution, but one which can intensify agriculture sustainably without damaging the environment. So I'm a fundamental plant biologist. I'm not an agronomist. I'm not a politician or any of those other sections that I talked about. But what I would like to tell you in the second half of my talk today is what people like me can contribute through our research and how that can contribute to this big challenge that I outlined today. And I would like to talk about two specific aspects. One is the importance of understanding the biology of plant responses to stresses. And the second is how we can exploit naturally occurring genetic diversity in order to improve the stress resilience of our current crops. And this is what we call the learning from nature approach. So in order to illustrate these points, I would like to take the example of one particular environmental stress that I have been working on a lot in my research career, and that is flooding. So to start with, I again have a question for all of you. So on the slide in front of you, what you see is a beautiful picture of a rice paddy. So my first question is, who all have actually seen a rice paddy field live? Okay, quite a few. So I don't have to explain to most of you that this is basically a field where rice seedlings are being grown, but they are being pushed into soil that has been flooded on purpose. So now my second question is, why is paddy rice grown in flooded conditions? Does any of you know, one of you know, who's seen a paddy field perhaps? Or just guess? To keep pests away. Close, but not the right answer. Anyone else? No? Exactly. So rice is one of the exceptions amongst our major crops in that it's actually tolerant of wet conditions. And this has been exploited in traditional rice farming to suppress weed growth, which normally would be removed using chemicals. So what the farmers do is they push rice seedlings into a flooded field in order to prevent the growth of weeds, but the rice is not affected. However, like I said, most crops are highly intolerant of flooding, and rice is actually an exception. So now I would like to tell you a question that scientists like me ask. So if plants are intolerant of flooding, what is the reason for that? So when a plant finds itself surrounded by water instead of air, gas diffusion is limited. And this is just high school physics. Gases diffuse way slower in water than in air. And for plants, two gases are of particular importance, and when they're flooded, availability of these two gases is limited. One is oxygen, and the other is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, hopefully all of you know this, is required for a very important process that plants carry out, which is very good. I'm so happy. Photosynthesis, because plants are unique, and in fact, all life on this planet depends on plants because they can use carbon dioxide and sunlight to make sugars, and that's the food we all eat. But for flooded plants, this becomes a problem because they do not have access to carbon dioxide, and also floodwaters are often very muddy and turbid, so light levels for a plant become highly reduced. So photosynthesis is limited. And also the limitation of oxygen results in low oxygen conditions within these plants, leading to hypoxia, which also causes an energy crisis because just like us, plants require oxygen in order to break down sugars and make energy, which is required for all kinds of processes that are required for life. Now, another problem with flooding is it's something we call a sequential stress, which means that once the floodwaters have retreated, the problem is not over for a plant. So why is this? This is because when the floodwaters go down, a plant which is used to the low light and low oxygen conditions of being underwater is suddenly exposed to extremely high light and normal oxygen conditions. And this results in the generation of toxic molecules which are very damaging to the plant. And secondly, the roots of this plant are not working anymore because of the tissues dying during the flooding period. So paradoxically, even though a plant finds itself in soil which has lots of water, it will show symptoms of drought or dehydration. And to illustrate this, here I have a time lapse. This is a plant that we use often in our research. It's called Arabidopsis thaliana. And this plant has been put underwater for a few days, and this is what it looked like when it came out of the water. So I'm sure you'll all agree that it looks quite okay. It's green and it looks alive. And this is what happens when it is allowed to be under normal conditions. And you can clearly see that the leaves start to dehydrate, they become yellow and they die. And this particular plant doesn't really die, but you can imagine that if you're talking about crops, you don't want a crop to barely survive. You want it to be able to actually deliver some yields, which we need as humans. So this is also a problem. However, there are plants that are quite at home in wet conditions. And it is of use to us to ask the question, how do these plants survive wet conditions, and can we learn from them? So, as an example, this is an image of a Dutch river landscape, which all of you are familiar with. And here grow two species, which also you probably have seen at some point, but not noticed or known what they were. One is called Rumex palustris, and the other is called Rumex acetosa. Rumex palustris, the plant on the left, it grows very close to the river edge, and therefore is exposed to a lot of flooding, which is also lasting a long time. So what it does is what we call an escape strategy. What it does is it starts elongating its leaves very quickly, and this allows it to breach the water surface. I have a video here which you can see. And once it has come out of the water, the leaf tips that are above the water can act as a sort of snorkel and aerate the rest of the plant. Because remember, gas exchange is the problem, so this allows the plant to actually breathe again. The other plant uses a completely opposite strategy, which we call a quiescence or a sit and wait strategy. It grows further up on the dike and does not experience as often flooding. So what it does is it stops growing. And the advantage is that it can conserve energy. So when the floodwaters are gone, it can use that energy to actually invest in growing. So you see different strategies for different situations, but both help the plant to actually survive. Another adaptation which is found in rice is what we call aerenchyma. So what you see in this image are slices of a rice root, and what you see are large air spaces. So what the plant does is it literally kills its own cells in order to produce these large air spaces which allow the plant to aerate itself. Another adaptation is what we call adventitious roots. And these are simply roots that replace the original root system and grow at the surface of the water where there is lots of oxygen. And these roots are full of these aerenchyma and also helps the plant to breathe. So all these adaptations a plant triggers when it is flooded. So another question that we ask is, but how does a plant know it is flooded and that it should do something about it? So here again we come to the gas diffusion model, and there are two signals that a plant uses. First is the drop in oxygen, or hypoxia. It's a stress for the plants, but it also is a very vital stress signal that tells the plant that it's flooded. But another gaseous signal that I didn't talk about is accumulation of the gas ethylene, which is a plant hormone. And ethylene, unlike oxygen, doesn't go down, but it accumulates in the plant. And this is because ethylene is produced by the plant always, but when there's water surrounding a plant, it's literally trapped and cannot go anywhere. And plants have learned to use this signal as a flood warning cue and trigger adaptive responses. As an example of how quickly this signal is generated, what you see on this slide are roots of a transgenic Arabidopsis plant that expresses a fluorescent protein that gets activated in response to this hormone. And what you can see is that already within an hour, of flooding, these proteins have started to accumulate in the root. So the next signal, hypoxia. How do plants sense oxygen decreases? Also an important signal. So here plants have proteins that are called ethylene response factors, which are master regulators of the plant hypoxia response. And what do I mean by master regulators? So these proteins are what we call transcription factors, which control the synthesis of hundreds and thousands of other genes that together allow a plant to respond to hypoxia and activate processes that will help them to cope with that stress. So these proteins become active as soon as a plant detects hypoxia. But under normal oxygen conditions, these proteins are continuously broken down in a process that uses oxygen. And what this ensures is that this process is only activated when the plant needs it, which is when oxygen levels start to decline, as happens during an environmental condition such as flooding. So, armed with this knowledge, I would now like to give you an example of the learning from nature approach. And this example is from rice, which might surprise you because I told you that rice is actually quite flood tolerant. It is, and it's for this reason that rice, a significant majority of rice farming, occurs in flood-prone regions. But that also makes it extremely vulnerable to flooding, especially intense flooding events. And because of this, a lot of rice production is lost. And to give you an example, annual losses can be up to 4 million tons. And to put it in perspective, that's enough rice to feed 30 million people. So that's a lot of rice that is lost. And the reason this rice is lost is because rice can tolerate shallow flooding, but if it's completely submerged like you see in this image, then most rice varieties will die. And these rice varieties are the Green Revolution rice varieties that I talked about, which were selected to be high yielding, but not selected to be flood tolerant to such intense flooding conditions. So scientists sought natural land races, which farmers locally had been growing in places where there was very frequent flooding. And an example is this variety known as FR13, ancient Indian rice race. And this variety could tolerate up to 2 weeks of complete submergence. And to cut a long story short, the gene that was responsible for this flood tolerance was identified. And it was this particular gene that you see, which is called sub1A. And the remarkable thing about this is that just the transfer of this particular region, DNA, into rice that did not have it and was not flood tolerant resulted in remarkable results. So what you see is a farmer standing in a field where on one side was a normal Green Revolution variety, and on the other side, exactly the same rice variety with the added gene. And you can see that following a 10-day submergence event, well, I don't have to tell you which rice variety did much better. And in terms of yield, which is always, of course, what we as humans are interested in, you can see the two lines that are going down. In both varieties, the yield is decreased, yes, but the varieties which contain the sub-1 gene do much better and maintain yields much better. And the image that you see is a field test that was done, again, with varieties that did have this region or did not. And you don't even have to read the lettering on that image to know the ones that had this flood-tolerant gene and the others that did not. And these sub-1 varieties have been used by millions of farmers across all different kinds of conditions, and it allows a rice variety to tolerate really up to 2 weeks of complete submergence and still maintain yields. So how does sub-1 tolerate submergence? So now that you all know everything about the biology of flooding, I can explain this. When a plant is submerged, ethylene accumulates. It switches on this particular gene. And what this gene does is it activates hundreds and thousands of genes that allow a plant to go into a quiescent mode. So basically, the plant will shut off any processes that are energetically expensive, stop growing, and in this way conserve energy. So once the floodwaters are gone, it can regrow and actually make grain. And also, sub-1 allows a plant to deal with those toxic molecules that I told you that accumulate after a flood has gone and which can damage a plant. And together, that is the reason why these varieties are actually able to survive. So in my own team, we have been also very interested in the role of these signals in allowing a plant to survive this stress. And what we found is that not only can plants detect these signals as a stress event, but also the sequence of these events. So plants can detect sequence hierarchy and actually know what it means. So what do I mean by this? So like I said, ethylene is a hormone and a gas that accumulates very quickly during flooding, and then subsequently, oxygen levels decline. And in keeping with this hierarchy of signals, we found that if you treat plants with this hormone and then expose them to hypoxia as a mimic of flooding, the plants which receive ethylene do much better. And the reason for this is that what ethylene does is it allows a plant to make lots of this protein that I told you that allows a plant to switch on hypoxia coping mechanisms. And because these proteins are already there in the plant, because of the ethylene effect, when it experiences hypoxia, it can activate those processes sooner and more effectively. And as an example of what I mean, here again, some transgenic plants. At the top are the shoots of the plant, at the bottom are the roots, and again, these are at the top, the blue coloring shows these proteins that are activated by ethylene, and in the bottom, the green fluorescence shows the same protein in the roots. So, what does this mean? This also shows another mechanism that plants can use in order to trigger flood coping mechanisms. And what we find is that this ability to use ethylene as a flood warning system is also a trait that has been potentially lost in cultivated species. So on the screen in front of you, you see two species. One is known as Solanum dulcamara, which is a flood-tolerant wild species, also known as nightshade. Perhaps some of you recognize that name. And on the right is a species that you're all familiar with, tomato. And what we find is that this ability to use ethylene to survive flooding is retained only in this wild species and has been lost in tomato. So this is also then a good approach or a good concept to use in order to boost the flood resilience of our cultivated, commercially relevant plant species, if we can find out how a plant can actually use ethylene to become more flood tolerant and then restore that mechanism in commercially relevant species. So in the last part of my talk, or the last 2-3 slides, What I would like to emphasize is also an aspect of understanding crop stress resilience that has been not as well focused on, but is now becoming or gaining recognition as being important, which is understanding multi-stress resilience. So I've been talking about flooding and heat and drought and how we should improve the resilience of plants to these stresses. But in the field, all these stresses can happen at the same time, either together, like heat and drought, or consecutively, like periods of flooding followed by periods of drought. So actually, it's also necessary to find crops or traits that will allow a plant to be resilient to multiple stresses. As an example, this is a picture of a field somewhere in the Netherlands. And can anyone recognize what this species is? What? Potato. Very good. Yeah, so this is potato, beautiful when it's flowering. And this is what it should look like, but sometimes it looks like this. This is a field after many days of drought. And then in the same season, it can look like this, where it's completely flooded. So you see why breeders and farmers, they really are looking for varieties that can withstand all these stresses. And this last slide, I would like to just briefly advertise a project that my own team is involved in, where we're looking at ways to improve multi-stress resilience in potato. And I don't want to go into the biology of it, but I just want to show this as an example of a project where multiple partners come together to solve the same problem for a very important crop. And potato is extremely sensitive to a lot of stresses. And this is what it looks like after just one day of the soil being too wet. I'm not talking about submergence or intense flooding, just the soil being wet. And this is what happens below the soil. The potatoes are completely gone. There's nothing left. And so in this project, we bring together many private and public stakeholders and also different academic universities, and in a project that is funded by the European Union, to really, from a lot of different perspectives, answer the question that is so important for all of us. If you would like to know more, I have the link down there of what we're doing within this project. But with that, I would like to come to my second last slide, which is a repeat of the one that I used before. But I hope that these two aspects that I wanted to illustrate are clear to you. And I hope also that the next time you walk into a supermarket and look at all those gorgeous fruits and vegetables, you will realize how privileged and lucky you are to be able to have access to that in such abundance. And I would like to end with acknowledging, of course, everyone whose work I have shown, and also funding from the Dutch Science Foundation. And with that, I would like to stop, and thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rashmi. Thank you. Is my microphone working? I'm doubting. No, it's working. Okay, perfect. I'm just gonna push this a bit more up. Thank you for showing how cool plants are. I think we can say that, right?
Yes, definitely.
Bit nerdy, but I was just curious because you showed us a picture of a farmer in his rice field where there was one side of the sub-1 variety and one side which was just the variety was grown before. In what sense do you work together with these farmers?
So
abroad?
I personally have never interacted with a farmer ever for my research program.
Yeah.
But
Give it to me. I will. No, you can hold it, but so let's keep it on this one now.
But definitely that is something that is done by my colleagues who actually do field trials in farmer fields.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're in this whole research group, and part of them are working in the field.
Yes.
You're working mainly in the lab, I think.
Yes. We don't do field trials.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it already being grown like the sub-1 varieties in large quantities, or is
Yes. Yes.
So it's being used already.
Yes. Sub-1 is one of the actually rare examples of actual tolerance loci that has been adopted by farmers very widely all over Asia, and it works beautifully in all kinds of conditions.
Yeah. And if I'm correct, the what you do is genetic modification, right? Mm-hmm. Some people are really scared of genetic modification. Mm-hmm. They say it's bad for your health, it's bad for maybe the environment. So maybe for once and for all, we can eradicate this idea. But what is your response to me saying, should we be afraid of it also, or is it safe?
This again is my personal opinion, but I think it's true that most people who make that argument actually have no clue how genetic modification works, how the legislation works, how stringent the safety protocol is before a genetically modified variety is allowed into commercial production. And if that person actually knew all that, the question would not be raised.
Okay. And do you also, because you talked about a lot about flooding and how to be more flood resilient, do you also research drought and for example, diseases? Because that's also a big problem, right?
Definitely. So my colleagues in the Department of Biology also look at the effect of all kinds of disease-causing pathogens on plants. I do not work on that, but we also work on drought as well. Like I said, both extremes of water, both water stresses is something that happens quite often together. So we're also looking for ways to make a plant resilient to both extremes. So can we find common traits or common mechanisms that allow a plant to be performing in both kinds of conditions? And of course, there's also a link between so for example, a plant that's growing in a wet field is more susceptible to diseases. So there's also a sort of cross-link between disease-causing pathogens and an environmental stress such as flooding. So in the end, it's all linked, and we need to
bring it all together.
Exactly.
Yeah. Are there any questions from the audience here in the room or online? Because I have my phone here. I saw there was already one question, so everybody who is watching from online can also type it in the live chat. But are there questions from the audience here? Please raise your hand. Yes.
Hey, you quickly mentioned that, of course, we should not be afraid of GMOs, but I do have one question of how can you mitigate the risks of GMO crops getting out into the wild and affecting ecosystems? And this way may be also threatening biodiversity in those ecosystems.
So there's two parts to that question, because you talked about biodiversity and GMOs. So I won't go into the detail of the safety and legislation, but what you talk about that how safe are these varieties in terms of a threat to the environment or to other natural species around, all that is part of the testing and safety and legislation that all these crops go through before they are approved for being, let's say, released or grown in the field commercially. So that's something that is never done without any testing. The second is you wanted to ask about biodiversity. So the biodiversity influence of crops can be both from genetically modified or gene-edited crops as well as normal commercially modified crops as well. Because in the end, the problem is also that farming is using specific varieties that are grown over large areas of land. And those large areas of land are cleared for these crops, and that's also a way that biodiversity is affected. So that's not necessarily something linked only to how the plant is modified, you know? Because that's also something that we all should realize, whether you modify a plant through traditional breeding or like our ancestors did 10,000 years ago, that's the same thing. You're still mixing DNA between, different varieties to get a new variety which has a fatter tomato or a better looking banana or more grain. It's the same thing. It's just that a different method is used to achieve that trait selection.
Yes. A question from someone next to me. I'll do the online one after it.
You mentioned that with GMOs we essentially do the same thing as our ancestors did thousands of years ago. And in essence, I kind of agree with you. Although now with gene editing, we can add genes that are, entirely not in the same, how do you call that, species or in the same region as in, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay,
we can
so
do
that's quite different though.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that is different. But I'm just saying, do not be afraid of technology, everything is subjected to testing before it is released for public consumption or released into the environment. So do not think that if it's transgenic, that it's somehow going to kill us all. That's just what I'm saying. You should understand the science behind it and the safety protocol behind it, and then assess what the pros and cons might be.
So you're not creating a Frankenstein in your lab? No. Okay.
I was wondering about those regulatory frameworks for GMOs and the safety for the environment and public health. What are some? I mean, there are quite some challenges when it comes to gene editing. Who is actually the owner of the species at that point? How does the social and the governance part of that work? Because I can see that regulations may change per country or region, and you don't want one company to have like the patents of a species that people are dependent on.
It's also a question from online. How do you make sure there's not some kind of dependency going on? It's a question from Leaf. How do you avoid economic exploitation and the creation of dependency of big companies? It's not your field of research, but maybe you can.
Yeah, so it's not my field of research, so I'm not an authority, so I will not comment on it from that perspective. Of course, there are rules and regulations in place, mostly from the government or maybe say EU, that look into all of that. How exactly that works, I'm not sure. But I do want to say that, of course, everyone focuses on companies like, say, Monsanto, which doesn't exist anymore, or Bayer, or all these biotech giants, and associate varieties or seeds or whatever with these companies. But do not forget that a lot of countries also have national agronomic institutes where a lot of research goes on. A lot of these traits and mechanisms and all are being incorporated into varieties and distributed for free to farmers. And so it's not like one or the other. There is also the other side where food and varieties get distributed, for the general public.
And I think, if I'm correct, there is more awareness now about awareness. There's more attention for not creating new breeds that, for example, needs some kind of pesticide to be able to survive, right? There's more attention for sustainability in that sense. Yeah.
In fact, techniques like gene editing are the way to reduce chemical input and, not do the intensive farming, which is degrading the environment, and, to be more sustainable. That's a very good approach to actually achieve that.
Which is because you talked about the Green Revolution. I think it was in the 60s, right? 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
There were species created that were dependent on
Yeah.
pesticides, right? That's a big difference now, you say.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, that was not really a concern. It was just
How
get
to
as
feed the
much yield
world.
as possible,
Yeah.
clear out forests. It was not really a concern at that point. So
Yeah.
there was no limit to how much chemicals or water you could use.
Yeah. Other questions from the room? Yeah.
I have a question about salination of our coastal areas caused by sea level rise.
Yeah.
Are we able to make our actual crops resistant for salination?
Yes, yes. So there's been a lot of research done on improving the salinity resilience of crops. Also, so the sub-1 varieties were developed and tested at an institute known as the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines. And they have also developed salt-resilient rice varieties, which can withstand what you're saying, so seawater flooding, and still perform well.
Question from online, from Remias. What are your thoughts on the use of CRISPR genome editing system in agriculture?
Yeah, I
That's
think
what you do,
it's-
right?
Yeah, like I said,
Yeah.
it's a fantastic technology, I think, because compared to, let's say, mutagenesis, which was used for, which is like really random mutations in the genome, and then you just have a product. This is
Yeah.
much more precise. You know exactly what you're doing. So I think it's going to be a tremendous tool for the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Hands in the air. Yes, sorry, I was looking the wrong side.
You shortly mentioned, like the monoculture fields and stuff. Is there any evidence that like having multiple species on fields makes them more resilient to like extreme weather conditions? And what would you advise on that?
Well, there is benefits for plant performance if you have mixed species, and also, yes, there has been evidence that a diverse collection of species growing together somehow is more resilient to environmental stresses than if you have a monoculture. We're not quite sure how that works and why, but yes, that has been observed.
So a question from Mike online. As a result of these floodings, our tropical countries, so the ones that suffer from increased droughts, making a transition from primarily rice production to another crop, for example. Are farmers changing their crop to be able to have enough food?
Yes, I mean, for many farmers, that's not such an easy option. But yes.
Why not actually? I say no, but why is it
Yeah,
not an easy
because
option?
I mean, especially in Asia, you have a lot of these smallholder farmers who have been farming in a certain way for many, many years, and you cannot just suddenly tell them stop growing rice and grow maize, because there's a lot of knowledge and, I don't know, agricultural practices, training, land management, everything that can be specific for specific crops. So one cannot simply flip overnight. And for a lot of these farmers, then the support has to come from, I don't know, government training programs or whatever to actually help them transition to perhaps another crop that does better in the changed conditions.
Yeah.
So they cannot do it by themselves. That's what I mean.
Yeah. And she mentioned like to grow a diverse variety of crops in a field, which can also help to make it more resilient to stress factors. So what are other, maybe, I'm not sure if you know about the other tactics you can use despite like the work you do, which help like, or make sure at least that not crops are being lost because of floodings and droughts. Like, are there other things you can do as well?
You mean in addition to having varieties that perform
Yeah.
better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can have preventive measures. So, for example, nowadays there's a lot of technology around predicting the climate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if available to farmers, that can help adjust the sowing and the planting and the harvesting in order to sort of adjust with the shifted climate, let's say. But then that facility has to be there, because that's also not trivial to have that technology. No. But that is definitely something that could help.
Yeah. Other question, there was somebody here. Yeah. I'm going to give it to you.
Yeah, so if you make one species very strong, couldn't that be harmful for like the rest of the ecosystem, that it's out of equilibrium or that it's pretty difficult to predict?
Yeah, I mean, biodiversity is naturally shaped by, environmental stresses naturally shape biodiversity, and our crops are very unnatural plant species because we've selected them for one particular purpose only, which is to yield grain. So yes, that is a problem, but for farming, there's not much you can do to avoid that, because you need to grow the crops, right? I mean, what you can do is prevent further decline in biodiversity by clearing away more land, but yeah.
Yes, I'm going to do one question from online, and I'm coming to you. Another question from Liv is, how far do you think we can push climate resilience through genetic modification? So to what extent are the adaptations found in the wild sufficient to withstand the climate stresses in the future?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, because, I mean, in the end, the point remains that you cannot go endlessly squeezing out grain from our crops. And for example, if temperatures reach 50 degrees, there's only so much a plant can do in those conditions. So the real problem is we need to address climate change and not just say, oh, we'll just keep improving our crops. So yeah,
that's the answer.
There will be a limit.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a similar question. So these plants, you are actually selecting for plants that are more resilient. They are actually better at survival, but what is the trade-off? Will we have to accept that the plants will have lower yields? And what does that mean in aspects of growing world populations, having to be able to feed more people? I guess it's an aspect that also needs to address more than just agriculturally. Yeah. But from your research, do you see what's the trade-off of these more resilient plants?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, for example, all these species that I showed that are adapted to a certain environmental niche, they just need to survive. Unlike our crops, they don't need to actually, in addition to surviving, produce huge fruits or lots of grain. But we want our crops to do that. So indeed, basically, these resilient traits are such that we are looking for yield maintenance. So the minimal loss of yield. So it's not like these crops, you put them in 50 degrees and they're still giving lots and lots of grain. That's not what we're looking for. It's just that they're able to give something compared to a total loss. And indeed, in terms of the biology, there's always a trade-off, because in the end, the plant has to decide whether to invest energy in making leaves or putting it into the grain. And we are trying to sort of adjust it so that it's the grain that it's putting the energy in, which is why in the case of sub-1, that is sort of like a conditional resilience trait. It's activated only when the plant is flooded, because otherwise you can have trade-offs for when there's no stress that it's not performing so well. So it's always you have to see for every particular trait and every particular species how it works.
And this is maybe a really bad question, but how long does it take you to research like a simple, like it seems so simple, like we just have found out about this ethylene and then we're going to implement it in the, like how long does it take to research
So
this?
I can give you an example. So the sub-1 work, which was done by labs in the US and at this Rice Institute, that took 50 years for that particular genomic locus to be identified. Of course, since then, technologies have advanced quite a bit that it's much faster, but it does take time. And of course, you have to also test it in the field to really take it from the lab to the field to see if it still works. So that definitely takes time, but with current methods like gene editing and all the technological improvements in sequencing the genomes of plants, it has become much faster.
Another question from Mike online is, it's something I asked you already, but he's really curious. How big is the research and implementation of the crops you mentioned, and what are the main challenges to implementation of these crops right now?
So how big are the...
How big is the research and implementation of the crops you mentioned? So I asked you, are you working together with farmers to develop this? But he is asking, and is it already being used? And you said, it's being used. But how many people are using these seeds now to grow rice? And are there any difficulties?
So if you're talking about sub-1, that's being used by millions and millions of farmers. But I think the question is also like, about just in general, how?
That's not completely, he's asking, maybe we should ask Mike online to reformulate, but how big is the research and implementation of the crops you mentioned?
So, for example, maybe I can clarify a bit. So, like, what the work I do is fundamental research. It's not, the questions we ask it's not always necessarily to put a plant in the field the next day. It's fundamental stress biology questions. However, questions asked at an agronomical institute, for example, are specifically to develop crop varieties that are tolerant to a certain stress or yield more in a certain condition. In any case, the ultimate step is always to test it in the field and see how well it behaves. And that definitely is something that is the final step. But of course, beyond that, there's also then all the legislation and the perhaps governmental policies for how the seeds will be distributed and who owns it and, you know, those kind of things. So there's more steps beyond identifying what kind of variety is good and what is not and what works and what doesn't.
Other questions from the audience? Yes.
I think there was a question earlier about trade-offs, and I wondered if when you're designing or testing plants for their climate resilience against drought or against flooding, that the genes being selected for that could be flood resistant, if they're let's say put in another plant, does that have trade-offs with like the yield or the nutrition of the recipient plant? Or is that beyond your research in particular, because it kind of goes into the agronomy side of...
So that's not, we don't test that, but that's definitely something that is looked into. For example, even if the yield is maintained or the loss is not as much, how is the quality of the output affected? That is definitely tested.
Did you have a question as well? No? Other questions? Yes.
Well, you said that when certain plants are submerged, it can survive by pausing energy-consuming processes, and that you're looking for a way to achieve this kind of resistance. But energy is also needed to produce nutrition. So could it have an influence or our nutritional value of our food?
So the quiescence strategy, so where the plant really stops doing anything, that's really when it's underwater. So when when it's actually submerged. Because, like I mentioned before, that's also a consequence of the flooding, that the plant cannot really make energy like it does normally when it has access to oxygen. So it's an energy conservation mechanism, but once the floodwaters are gone, the plant can restart again, and then it's not a problem because, then it can kickstart all the metabolic processes and start making new leaves and grain, and so that's not a problem anymore.
A question from online is from Monica. Do you see future crop production still dominated by monocultures? And what additional resilience can be achieved with polycultures?
So yes, I do see future cropping systems which are not so reliant on monocultures, because of course one of the biggest problems is that then, if there's, for example, a disease or other factors that affect a crop, then basically you wipe out everything. So definitely that is the way to go in the future. And what was the other question?
What additional resilience can be achieved with polycultures?
What additional resilience? I'm not quite sure I understand what
Maybe
she
what are the
means.
challenges, but I think we already discussed it. It's drought, it's flooding, it's viruses.
Yeah, so multi-stress resilience, definitely. Yeah.
So all these different factors.
Yeah.
Another one, it's more, I'm not sure, I'm going to ask it, but I don't think you have an answer directly. But how do you relate your research with issues of power and control? Shouldn't it be better to construct a governance so that farmers remain in power over the seeds instead of multinationals?
Yeah, so my work has nothing to do with that, so I cannot provide expert advice or comment on that. But yeah, that's all government policy and legislation.
So that's maybe something we will discuss in one of the other lectures which are coming. I think not sure which day, but Koen Beumer also discusses a bit more like these topics. It's the 5th lecture in this series. Are there other questions from the audience still? Somebody wants to ask Rashmi a question?
There's one in the front here.
One in the front, sorry.
Is a GM related to zero alcohol beer?
Oh, I don't know. I have no clue. But I thought that is a process that happens after the plant has been used. Like it has nothing to do with the plant.
Yeah, that's not both. I don't know. It's a question, so
I must say that I don't really know. I don't know. Sorry.
No other questions? Then I think we're done. Thank you. Give a final round of applause for Professor Rashmi Sasidharan.